This is From the Courtroom to the Boardroom, the podcast for the next generation of legal leaders with me, Simon Gibson. I was a lawyer for 13 years until I walked away from legal practice and entered the world of business. I'm now CEO of the Sharpening Group and I lead a portfolio of businesses in the UK and Australia. On this upbeat podcast, I tackle the big issues facing law firms and businesses alike with the help of intriguing guests. Are you ready to rewrite the script? Then it's great to have you along for the ride. Hello friends, Simon Gibson here. Welcome to the podcast. We're talking people crisis today. Every law firm I've spoken to for the past 12 months at least, when I ask them what their biggest challenge is, it's recruitment and it's retention of their people. We're in the UK today, but I've got businesses in Australia. I've got lots of friends and clients in the legal profession in the US also. And everyone's talking the same thing. The labour market has never been more challenging. People are talking about staff willing to leave for an extra £1,000 a year. People are talking about record sick days. We've seen that in the news, that the UK in particular has record absences due to ill health. And of course, that costs money. And it also presents challenges. Now, I want to find out what the underlying causes are of the people crisis, and then to try and find some solutions, because we're all in the same boat here, and it's important that we can identify where we go from here. We need some help with this. I'm really delighted that I'm going to be welcoming Gemma Bullivant to the podcast today. Gemma is a HR consultant who has worked with businesses to get the best from their people for the last 20 years. In particular, Gemma works with law firms and other professional services businesses on how to motivate the team, on how to construct their reward structures, and how to attract the top quality talent that we all need to make the best of providing legal services. So I'm really looking forward to this chat with Gemma. I'm going to ask Gemma at the end to give us her top tip for anyone who's frustrated by the people crisis. And I really hope that you get best value from this episode of From the Courtroom to the Boardroom. It's going to be a quick word about our fantastic sponsor and then straight into the recording with Gemma Bullivant. Podcast today is brought to you by Zeus Tech Solutions, who provide dev on demand for law firms. When I was managing partner of a law firm, recruiting and retaining top tech talent was one of the biggest challenges. And we're still, because we didn't have the knowledge in the business to manage and coach a technical team, it was a constant cycle of frustration, downtime, lost revenue, and proclaim lying dormant. Well, for the past 5 years, Zeus have supported both of Sharpening Group's law firms in the UK and Australia, and it's been a game changer. Now we get all of the technical support we need, from IT director to .NET developer, on tap and when we want them. Zeus provide the best use of tech to all of our fee earners with no recruitment fees and absolutely no nonsense. So if you're a law firm who are frustrated with their tech anywhere in the world, go to www.zeustechsolutions.co.uk and hit the live chat option, and the answer to all of your tech solutions, however specific they are, is right there. Better still, if you mention that you heard about Zeus on the podcast, you will get a free health check for your case management system. So that's Zeus Tech Solutions, dev on demand for law firms. And now on with the podcast. Gemma Bullivant, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Simon.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this. Now, before we get stuck into the really important issues around why businesses are struggling to recruit and how to retain top talent, you've been helping businesses for years. How did you first come to move into that sector?
Well, I fell into HR in the mid-90s. I started in an HR role and just fell in love with the whole idea of kind of working with people, working with motivation, working with getting people to work at their best. And I think when I talk about HR, it often conjures up loads of different ideas. My version of HR is not necessarily the governance, compliance, process side, even though that is very important. But it's actually more the psychology side. It's more the people side, not in the soft and fluffy way, actually quite the reverse, in the kind of how do we challenge, stretch, get the best out of people? How do we look at things from the lens of what are people going to think about this? How can we get people really excited by this? How can we support people to actually grow and develop? That's my angle for HR, working really commercially to help businesses maximise all the great stuff that talent and people can bring to organisations.
Well, it's great to hear you say that, because I think when we think of HR, we do tend to think of the fluffy stuff and the contracts and signing in people late and all those sorts of things. But of course, working with a HR professional is all about getting the best out of your people. And if law firms and other professional practices, if there's ever been a time where they need to do that, it's now, when actually recruiting people and retaining people has never been more tough. When you get retained by a business to help them with their people, to help support and get the best out of the people, what are some of the areas that are of most relevance?
I think the most common challenges that I'm getting at the moment, and certainly in the last few years, has been attraction and retention. It has been leadership effectiveness, personal effectiveness. And then the third sort of arm really is all around kind of reward, pay, benefits. And when I talk about that with clients, one of the first things I sort of try and help people understand or remember is pay is hygiene, but pay itself isn't going to motivate on its own. If you get it wrong, you've got a problem. If you get it right, you're neutral, because then you need to do all of the other things. So for me, some of those kind of processes, mechanisms, and analytical data kind of points are really, really important, but we have to also do the things that sit around it that actually bring those to life.
It's such a good point you just made there on pays the minimum. Do you ever think there's a situation when businesses pay so well that unhappy team members will stick with them?
Totally. And you sometimes do find businesses that have got an average length of service that is incredibly high, double digits, without any kind of question. And some turnover actually is quite helpful. It helps to bring in kind of fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, some challenge, some conflict that's healthy, that just helps people kind of, sort of bring in the new ideas. So you can get quite stuck if you have extremely low turnover. But we do know that turnover and retention can be really costly. So we've got to get the balance right.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking of high cost, that probably segues us nicely into this discussion on the people crisis. Law firms, other professional practices I talk to, every one of them, one of the first things they say is we cannot get people through the front door. It's not any particular role. It tends to be in law firms from senior solicitors right down to paralegals, office staff, legal tech. It's a challenge across the board. And I mean, I was looking at the PwC report on sick days and the cost of sick days, which we're going to include in the episode content for people to read who want to. And I mean, the cost of these sick days is eye-watering. And of course, if we read the PwC report in terms of cost alongside what seems to me in the UK to be a crisis in the NHS, I know some countries do a lot better than we do in terms of providing that health service. But if you put those two things together, on the one hand, record sick days in the UK, and on the other hand, the news this morning is that people are waiting 40 hours for an ambulance. So before they can even get to a hospital, they've got a long wait. Those sort of issues just make this recruitment crisis all the more worrying. I just wondered, first of all, on this issue of sickness, what's your take? Why is this happening?
I've been thinking about this, to sort of think about how best I can describe this from my experience and my observations, and a little bit of my opinion I will offer, which is, if we think about absence, we've probably got two broad categories of absence. We've got absence to do with physical health, and we've got absence to do with mental health. And they are linked often, they don't sit completely separate to each other, but there are some really different things that drive both of those types of absence. And I think if we sort of think first of all of the physical health category, there has to be a connection in terms of the uptick of absence to do with the NHS waiting lists, whether that's how long it takes you to see a GP, and whether that means that you've got several days more needed to sort of recover than if you'd actually managed to see a GP or get some form of medical attention sooner, whether that's something different to the GP. But then there's actually the NHS waiting lists for kind of procedural operations, and obviously COVID had a big impact on that as well. But it isn't a COVID issue. It was long before COVID that we had these growing waiting lists, and it made me think that when I look at, I mentioned that I do a little bit of work around pay and reward for clients. So sometimes I'm looking at the private medical insurance, kind of literally their claims. And always high on the list of what the category of claim that PMI providers report on is musculoskeletal. So that's to say bad knees, bad hips, physio, anything it can be sports related, but often it's actually maybe bad backs, posture. So if we're delaying through NHS waiting lists, we're delaying the medical attention needed just on the very kind of what we would think of as procedural, that has to be having an impact on people being able to turn up to work. So there's that physical side of things from the NHS. And then what I know from the other work that I do is mental health support. The waiting lists through NHS mental health providers are longer than ever. So people don't necessarily have immediate or even kind of, prompt access to mental health support services. So I think those two areas combined, there is definitely a connection with the sort of the crisis, the funding crisis that we're sort of starting to read more and more about in terms of the NHS.
Well, I mean, yes, on both fronts. So let's take those 2 points in order. I mean, the first point you were making is interesting about these different options that employers have to try and circumvent the NHS waiting lists. And one of those, as you quite rightly say, is to provide some form of health insurance or access to certain types of rehabilitation. And I mean, we do that, and I know many employers that do. But what is really quite galling and disruptive is that you've got there, from a business's perspective, the worst of both worlds. Because on the one hand, corporation tax is going up. We're all seeing in the autumn statement in the UK and elsewhere in the world that taxes are very much on the up and up. We understand the reasons why. But to be in a situation where on the one hand your taxes are going up, but on the other hand, the services that are provided to your team in the NHS is getting worse, is quite a disruptive and worrying position. So I think where most employers are is great. Let's do the health insurance, but to raise our taxes as well is a double whammy that's really unwelcome. The second point on mental health, I mean, I can't agree with you more. I mean, the lack of mental health service and the sort of delays and just lack of access to resources in this day and age, when we see that mental health is such an issue in the general population, is really disastrous. In terms of that side of well-being, are you ever asked by business clients for alternatives to referring their clients to the NHS in the event that they're going through some tough times?
Absolutely. And it's fascinating because even when clients have some systems in place or providers in place, perhaps through private healthcare, like employee assistance programs, EAP programs that lots of people have heard of, is the extent to which people focus their energy on preventative as opposed to reactive and crisis. So I think people can generally get their heads around, crisis support, with when somebody kind of actively needs some support because a mental health challenge has emerged. But sometimes there's quite a lot to be said for preventative. So one of the things that I do is I work with grief and loss and bereavement, and that very challenging, confronting topic. And when I talk about that with clients and with organisations, what I talk about is the fact that you've got it's an easy one to describe in the terms of the reactive or crisis type of intervention. Because let's take bereavement. When a loved one dies, you are in crisis. You have a very immediate problem, a very immediate challenge that you're facing. And organisations can sort of point you to crisis counselling. You can access bereavement leave, paid bereavement leave. Perhaps that's extended through compassionate leave. There's a sort of an immediate support. Then there's actually quite a gap, typically. And that gap is almost, okay, so bereavement takes longer than 2 or 3 weeks. But what do you do whilst it's taking several months and in some cases years to transition and provide the sort of support that people often need? And that's one of the areas that I sometimes step in to do, which is to say, we're not necessarily going to resolve or heal the actual bereavement here, but what I can do is help an individual start to adjust as they return from bereavement leave into working life again, getting on with life, getting on with all the things that you need to get on with, but with the frame around it of what's happened, that allowing them just that support to sort of guide them through what they need to think about. And that can be things like how to communicate, how to manage emotional kind of, reactions to things, how to manage, self-care. Sleep is often affected during those times. And those sorts of things are what I would almost describe as not necessarily crisis. Obviously, it's reactive because it's reactive to a situation, but it's thinking about things before they've become an even bigger problem than they are already. That kind of support, I think, is lacking enormously. And it's a huge opportunity for employers to really think differently about how they can support employees before it becomes an extended absence challenge.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the sort of the need for employers to rethink, and we've had to do that, haven't we? Because we've had this pandemic, which was a situation not only which presented practical challenges and business continuity challenges and things like market challenges, but it presented specific well-being challenges both during the lockdowns, but now as well, because obviously mental health problems in the lockdown environments over that extended period of time. Well, I think we all had a bit of that, didn't we? We all were a bit up and down during that period. Have you noted any particular change in either employee behaviour or just in terms of the challenges that businesses and employees face after the pandemic?
Yes, I have, and I've noticed a couple of things in particular. One is the ease with which we dismiss the impact of that lockdown period, and people kind of almost struggle to understand why they are experiencing some mental health challenges, and it's in relation to their current reality, forgetting that actually that's building on, what's happened over the last few years with all the challenges that went there, because everything goes into the same bucket. We have a bucket of things that happen to us, and Mental Health First Aid England talk about a stress container. And what they say is that, and I love this analogy, is that everything that happens is almost like water going into our bucket. So the COVID, all the different experiences and challenges that we faced during COVID is, several taps of water, but then there's, work pressures, there's family pressures, there's our own health issues if we have them. All of that is water going into this bucket. But the important point is it's the same bucket because it's our bucket. We can't compartmentalize. We don't have a bucket for this and a bucket for that and so on. It's all in one bucket. And the important point there is that if the water that's going in now is going on top of an already almost full bucket, it will overflow. And that's that idea of the accumulation of things having a really big impact. But our rational understanding of what's going on right now only sees the last tap and thinks, why is that so difficult? Why am I finding that so challenging? When actually it's not that's necessarily the big issue. It's what it's going in on top of that is causing that overwhelming feeling.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because as employers, this is all, we're entering here still, I think, quite a new area in which I sometimes get a little bit cynical when I see businesses who are really promoting the commitment to well-being. They're saying this because things are going well. And that the moment the bottom line starts to get squeezed, that stance might change. And the priority might then be on improving the bottom line rather than people's well-being. However, what the PwC report shows very clearly is that if we do take that approach, the bottom line gets worse. Because if, as you say, if that jug starts to overflow, and people become overwhelmed through a combination of what's going on in their life and what's going on with the work, well, businesses will lose money. So it's if that cynical approach that I mentioned is adopted, it's counterproductive both to the employee and to the business.
Absolutely. Well, one of my, some might say many, soapboxes is the difference between sort of concept and theory, and in some ways intention. We want to support our employees' well-being. We see that this is important. We do recognise that ethically, morally, or just commercially, it's the right thing to do. But what we do in practice is go, oh yeah, we do really need to run that well-being session to give people some tools, but actually, could you do it at 6 o'clock because we've got like a really full day? And I'm like, should we just pause there for a minute and just think about what that is actually doing? It's role modeling, trying to actually extend someone's working day, go into somebody's kind of, personal sort of timing or so on a topic that's giving people the tools to actually say no to things like that or to manage those things differently. I mean, it's amazing how often that just happens because we're trying to fit stuff into a day, and it's extending the day, or it's reducing people's flexibility. All the things that we conceptually know are really important. And you pay someone like me to sort of talk about how you can actually kind of help your own resilience and do these things, but actually then what it's doing is but the reality is we haven't really got time in the day. Could we squeeze it in at tea time? Could we do a tea time slot?
Yeah. So I totally get what you're saying. I mean, we talk there about the well-being aspects in making sure we've got good retention and that we can credibly recruit people on a message that their well-being is part of the package that we offer. But what about the economic factors in this people crisis? Because it seems to me that what's happened is a bit of a turning of the tables. And as we head into a recession, we're told, and a global recession, it is a very strange situation to be in, that still there's loads of jobs. And still, people are saying we cannot find the people. So that, on a supply and demand basis, suggests to me that money will still be important. and other sort of benefits around the financial package will still be important, because you've got to attract the talent in the first place, and people might not join you on a wellbeing message alone. So on that sort of supply and demand basis, there just doesn't seem to be the people. What do you tell employers about other areas that they have to present to their potential talent of the future in terms of being attractive to them?
I think, we've talked a lot about well-being, but the other things that I'm often asked to help people with is really thinking about how you can sharpen your attraction and retention tools in the business. And for me, that comes down to getting really clear on what I call a total reward strategy. Because I do a lot of work in reward, people often immediately go to pay, which is part of it. But total reward is all the reasons that someone might choose to join, choose to stay, or choose to leave an organisation. And they're all levers. They're all, as in levers, not leaving the business, because they all play a part. And what we need to do is get really clear on your levers in the business. So sometimes it might be that you pay well, but if you pay on market, then perhaps what you need to do is think, well, what's the culture like? What are the sort of the really key defining things about the culture? What kind of performance growth and career growth can you offer people? Can they see a pathway? Can they see that they will grow and develop and build their career in your organisation? Do they value the kind of work that you do? Is there something kind of more values driven that's important? All of these things, some of them will be kind of a smaller lever, and some will be a bigger lever in the overall picture. And I often sort of draw a picture and sort of say, okay, so how much of a factor is culture? How much for you? How much of it is the some of the other things that I mentioned? And to get to the heart of that, sometimes I sort of say, well, if you were listening in on a conversation, looking in on a conversation that an employee is having with a friend or somebody outside, they're down the pub, how are they describing what it's like to work in your organisation? How are they describing their job, their career, where they're at the moment? And if they're talking about some of the things that I've just mentioned in terms of, it's challenging, but I get to work on great client work, I get to do this, I get to do that, then you're starting to identify those things are really important to our employees. And we can leverage that, and we can make sure that we're making that really evident in the market. We're making sure that people kind of recognise that when you come and work for us here, you'll get to work on really great work. You'll get to work with some really interesting or challenging kind of projects, or you'll get to work with really fun, collaborative, supportive people. So whether it's the work that's the lever or the sort of the environment, but don't try and do everything. Try and come up with what your own USP is to actually kind of stand out from the next organisation that's doing something perhaps a bit similar to you, but how do you actually differentiate yourself in that way? And it's quite a marketing exercise, actually.
That's interesting. Let's move on to some solutions then, because the majority of our audience is law firms, and law is a highly competitive sector. There's lots of law firms, there's associated businesses, there's in-house legal teams, and law firms have quite a diversity of challenges to bring top talent into the business. Because you've mentioned there, one of the things which lawyers want is top quality work. So they want professional gratification. They want work that they enjoy and which is consistent with their experience and their aspirations. They also want to be well paid. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Indeed, the academic and the training journey that lawyers have to go through is totally consistent with wanting to earn a really good living. And then, of course, there are these other issues which exist in other businesses, such as they want lots of team members want to look at the hours they work. They want more flexibility. They want to look at good work-life balance. They want nice colleagues. They want, it's quite a diversity of challenges that law firms face. So I wondered maybe if we start off with that issue of the work that the lawyer or the legal support team would be doing. I don't see much of that. You mentioned a marketing exercise. When I see lawyers recruiting, I don't see much of them properly promoting the quality of client they have. Should lawyers be doing more than that?
Definitely. If that's something that stands out as a particular feature of the type of work that you do as a law firm, then why not celebrate it? Why not talk about it? If that creates energy, if that creates engagement, if that in some way forms some of the glue that you need to hold on to the people that the talent that you want to pull people through or support people through the structure and to more senior roles and build their careers with you. If that forms part of that picture, why not talk about it? Why not make sure that it's actually something that we enable people to be inspired by? And actually that's part of it's great to work here because I cut my teeth in HR at Linklaters, so I do understand that sector. But what I also have done over the course of my HR career is work in different sectors. But what I've noticed time and again is that energy, that kind of professionalism, is so undercooked, if you like. It's so it's not given in as much focus as I think it should have. Because what we tend to do as professionals is really value the type of work we're doing. We've worked hard to train in this stuff. We want to work on stuff that is going to stretch us, challenge us, take us to the latest thinking, the latest approaches, the latest, legislation, whatever it might be, that is actually kind of keeping us really current, challenged, stretched, and across some really interesting work.
Good suggestion. I think the other challenge that law firms have is, as you said earlier, the vast majority of businesses will fully acknowledge and embrace the ethical and moral principle that we have a duty to look after our team and to support our team. Where I think in professional services that sometimes conflicts with other areas is because there's a big demand on performance. So in particular law firms that be faced with increasing expectation from client and I think probably decreasing loyalty, so that there is a demand that people work harder. Businesses generally, and law firms are no exception, are faced with rising taxes. They're faced with the possibility of a recession. They've got to cling on to clients. We've got a cost of living crisis. There's a greater demand on salaries. So law firms and other professional services businesses, on the one hand, embrace the need to look after the team. But on the other hand, the simple fact of business life is that they have to drive top performance. Is there a conflict there? And if there is, what's the solution?
Well, yes, I think there absolutely is a conflict, and it's a great point. I think it goes back to something I was sort of talking about and thinking about earlier, which is around that walking the talk, if you like. I didn't use those words, but it was the idea of it's all very well saying that something is important, but if the actions are not actually kind of role modeling those principles, then actually what happens is people see that disconnect and almost it fuels the wrong response to that. So it makes it even more difficult to land the ethical importance of well-being when you're not actually walking the talk. I think the idea of performance is fascinating because there's so many different ways you could describe performance. So I think that effort is sometimes shrouded in the guise of performance. You work hard, you work long hours, but are you actually producing the results?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, it's so interesting you said. I think law firms have got a particular problem with this. I mean, I've got friends who are in the corporate world, in legal, and they've made this exact point, that there's always been a culture of long hours in corporate and commercial legal businesses. And I've mates of mine who are partners in those firms. They sometimes make the point that for people just to go home early is frowned upon. And that even if you've got nothing to do, if you're not still in the office at 8 o'clock, there's a cultural issue there. And it seems to me that what businesses actually want is not the behavior, they want the outcomes. And if someone is able to deliver the outcomes without living by that sort of expected culture, I think that's what needs to be embraced. It's about focused on what it is we need to do. What is it that we need to achieve? What does success look like? And base the culture around that, not the theory that just pure effort or the image of effort is what leads to great results.
Completely. And it's making me think of that whole busyness kind of epidemic, if you like, of how are you? Oh, I'm so busy. Well, yes, you are. Back-to-back meetings, back-to-back Teams calls that we know are having a lot of impact on our brain. There's some fascinating kind of research emerging of kind of, ECGs of brains and what our brain looks like when we've had one call after another call after another call, as opposed to putting breaks in the day, is actually having quite a physical effect on us. And remote work is a whole new dimension for such a lot of us. And it's happened so quickly that we're still trying to understand it and trying to kind of gather the information on it. But this whole idea of presenteeism, working hard, being seen to work hard, and not celebrating that actually that person has produced above and beyond the results that we would ever want. The client is super happy, and they happen today to have finished at 3 o'clock, and they could get home and see their son or daughter in the school play. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's everything right with it, isn't it?
But it's what happens in reality versus what we know to be kind of, it's the mismatch, isn't it? It's the mismatch between those two things. Are you walking the talk?
Definitely. And happy people are more productive. So if you're able to produce both a working environment and a working pattern which is consistent with happiness, and to me, happiness is being able to schedule into your waking day the parts of your life which are important, which include work, they include family, they include social time, they include your hobbies. If you're able to facilitate your team having that schedule, I think you'll benefit in terms of both your working environment, your recruitment and retention, and ultimately how much money you make. So none of these things are mutually exclusive. And that's what I've found anyway.
I completely agree. And when you were talking before about the sort of some of the systemic pressures, we were talking a little bit about how much it costs to kind of fund or put extra funding into support, whether that's through the NHS or whether that's through private healthcare and other ways that privately we can support our employees. The question then comes back to how do we justify that spend? And yes, there's the sort of the moral and ethical kind of parts of that equation. But then there's also this sort of hidden cost of, whether it is to do with actual absence, whether it is to do with the less tangible reduced performance because people are working on 50% of battery, individual battery rather than 100% of individual battery because of kind of overwork, or whether it's simply because retention costs a lot of money, but we never really truly articulate how much it costs consistently. So I was asked to help a client recently to really work on a particular part of their business, professional services business, massively high turnover rate for them, well above what they would normally expect. And I asked them how much they kind of put as a sort of a number on each vacancy or each leaver that each person that leaves the organisation. And they said, well, we usually sort of talk about a third of the person's annual salary. Now, some organisations do a slightly different metric, but somewhere between a third and a half of the year's salary is often actually not a bad measure, because if you think about it, it'll take a couple of months minimum to find somebody, a couple of months to sort of get them on board, a couple of months to get them up to speed. There you've got 6 months. If you then put that person's annual salary in those terms on a piece of paper and say, okay, so if our attrition rate is 25% and we're losing, 100 people on £50,000, then we're actually losing 250. It's costing us £250,000. If we bring that down from 100 people to 50 people, we've saved £125,000. How much of that £125,000 will it take to actually create the initiatives, the support, the infrastructure and so on to actually kind of open up that saving? And you can start to have some really interesting conversations about how cyclical this is. So when we talk about the NHS waiting list and how much it costs to fund the NHS waiting list, and then we look at the costs that are coming out of all these different reports, PwC, Deloitte, the one that you've mentioned before, but others. There's one today or this week in the Financial Times. These numbers are huge, and it's cyclical, because if we can start to move one, we can start to move some of the money from one place to the next.
Yes, exactly. And there's some eye-watering sums of money involved there, isn't there, if we don't get this right? And it sort of takes us back to the PwC report. Well, it's been such a pleasure having your expert input, Gemma. It really has. And I hope everyone watching and listening has gained real value from your expertise. I certainly have. All of your details are on the podcast episode caption, including your website. But before we let you go, I'm going to ask this to all of my guests. There's a people crisis. We are in a situation where it's tough to recruit and tough to retain. If you now were advising a law firm who was frustrated, who was seeing high turnover of staff, tricky recruiting, where would you advise? And if you can do this in 60 seconds, that's a challenge I'm backing you to achieve. Where would you advise them to start?
Oh, I love an elevator challenge. I would say there's 3 things. I'd say there's get really clear on that total reward framework strategy that I mentioned, all the reasons someone might join, stay or leave the organisation. What are your levers to that? How can you actually focus budget on the right areas to maximise those? I would really look at the how you approach flexibility in terms of working hours, in terms of sort of what you expect to see as outputs, in terms of how you can maybe access a different part of the talent market to think differently about flexibility. And then the third area I would say is really think about how well you're walking the talk, which is what, something I mentioned before. Are the leaders and managers in your business supporting, listening, trusting, role modeling the kind of wellbeing practices, performance management practices, and working practices generally that you're aspiring and wanting to have in place? Are they actually role modeling them? Do they have the tools, the skills, the confidence, and the permission to actually do that?
Well, Gemma, thank you so much. We've got a people crisis in the legal sector, but you've given us such a useful toolkit there through which to tackle it. It's been wonderful having your company. Thank you again for your time and your expertise. I hope everyone watching and listening has got value from that. My very best wishes to you all. I'm Simon Gibson. Podcast is from the Courtroom to the Boardroom. We're out every other Wednesday on all platforms. Take care. I'll see you soon.